Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have two very special guests. We have Gwendolyn Dolske. She's an author, speaker, and professor of philosophy at California State Polytechnic University. And we have Rudy Salo. He's an infrastructure and transportation finance lawyer, writer, actor, and public speaker. And Gwen and Rudy are both hosts of the incredible Good is in the Details podcast. Each episode is a conversation with experts from a variety of fields who can tell us more about what is the good life. Welcome, Gwen and Rudy.
Hi.
Hi, guys. Hi there. Hello again, as we just saw each other about a week or so ago.
I know, right? We should we have to find like a way to link the two episodes together, because what I want to do is like a continuation of where we sort of left off. So obviously we kind of started talking about our history and sort of our backgrounds, but then we were also trying to figure out like how you guys got your podcast started. So, I mean, for people who don't know, the Good is in the Details podcast is essentially one of the top philosophy podcasts out there. And then from what the little bit that I read about the background, it seems like when you started it, and then Rudy, who's like the ultimate contrarian here and clearly hates philosophy, somehow got on board. so I mean, that's like a really interesting juxtaposition. So can you first tell us how you got the ball rolling? And then obviously, Rudy, I'd love to hear your story on this.
Rudy's the contrarian. I picked up Rudy because he has fantastic hair. Mm-hmm. But I really started with just this suspicion that the classes and the conversations that I was having with my students, that there could be a broader audience for the discussions that we have in philosophy. So I'd have students who were emailing me long after the semester ended, or even wanting to stay after class. They would talk about a film that they saw that reminded them of something we talked about, or they had some questions about their own life or own problems. And there were a lot of debates in philosophy about things like, do you have free will? Does God exist? Do you have a mind? What is real? So there were so many questions that the students were having. And I thought, I don't want to keep this in the ivory tower. I really believe in education. I believe in curiosity. I believe in dialogue. I think that that's part of what makes life good. I think that that's part of what makes life enjoyable. We don't really enjoy studying or being in a classroom so much and being quizzed, but I think we genuinely enjoy learning new things, having those aha moments. And so really the same skill set that I use to put a syllabi together is what I do to put the podcast together. And I just came to Rudy. I knew that Rudy liked to do public speaking. He's also a very curious, witty, intelligent individual. And so I thought that it would be a lot of fun for us to do this. Oh, wait, just... Mm-hmm. I thought it would be a lot of fun. And I am so grateful to Rudy for believing in it, because Rudy's like a proper adult. I'm just waiting for another one. He's like,
I don't even know what that means.
I know. He's like,
I think the only criteria is having good hair.
He is amazing. He has so much on his plate. And I'm just like, and I have this idea, and I just appreciate him having faith in that idea, that he said he was on board, because really, I think he's part of the magic of it, that if I get too nerdy about philosophical concepts, he is really great in introducing his own set of, knowledge from law, but also film noir. He also loves science fiction, and he also has a great wit. And I think it just works nicely together.
All right, so Rudy.
I'm almost speechless, but that's actually impossible because I always have something to say. It's very kind. I was on a phone call. Gwen reached out once to me and she had another podcast. I don't think things went well there. She knew that I was a student of podcasting and was very passionate about podcasts. At the time, I was a transportation contributor to an automotive podcast because I'm a transportation junkie. I mean, I love you can read any of the writings that I did. I don't need to get into it here, but you can go back and listen to episode 2 of Good is in the Details, and it kind of lays out my philosophy of importance of transportation and society. And I mean, it's what I do for my day job. And just Gwen reached out. She's like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this new podcast. Would you, want to be a guest, occasional guest host? Would you be a supporter? I just told her absolutely. I believed in her wholeheartedly, how smart she is, and she's funny and she's very willing to talk to a crazy person. She talks to crazy people very well, and that because I'm referring to myself. And I just thought it was a great idea because what I realized this is no dig on my prior podcast experience, but I felt very boxed in. There's only so much you can do as a transportation contributor on an automotive podcast. Like you kind of you repeat the same things over and over again, and I really did feel like I was kind of boxed in. And I guess the kindest word I could say about myself is I'm a dynamic person. And the reason why is because I'm just a big nerd. I love to learn. And while I am passionate about transportation, that's only a sliver of me. What I'm really passionate about is learning. And as much as I beat the hell out of philosophy and philosophy teachers and philosophy students and all that stuff, philosophy is really the love of learning. I mean, that's what I've come to learn after being on Good is in the Details is you're constantly learning. Well, the reason why is because you never get any damn questions answered. and as a result of that, I think I have found my home in philosophy and with this podcast, because I really do love to learn. I with a passion. And in fact, one of the things that I love about film and acting, especially writing, is whenever you're going to write a film, if you're going to write like a plot line or something about the film, you really got to get into the details of characters' lives. And okay, well, this person is a mechanic. Okay, well, what kind of a mechanic? Okay, well, this person is a boat captain. Okay, what kind of a boat captain? And you got to get like really deep down into the details in order to find those little nuggets to make sure that the film has authenticity. And so if you truly are a student of learning, it's just like endless. There's so many things that you can do with your life. And so I am a student on Good is in the Details podcast. I'm learning as I'm going along with it because I love learning. And so Gwen is the teacher. I am the student. I just happen to be that annoying student that constantly talks shit back to the professor. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
No, absolutely. And in fact, speaking of film, I did a deep dive on both of you. And Rudy, you in particular, I saw some of your short films via your
you
link
watched those? Oh man,
I watched them. Yeah. Sanguine
God bless
episode
you,
1.
man.
Yeah,
God bless you.
Curtain Call. Yeah. So Fortune Cookie, right? That one was very interesting to me. Was that a philosophical sort of a film? Because I wonder if it has any ties to that. It was very interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for watching it. And thank you for watching anything that I'm in. It is so much appreciated. Fortune Cookie, yes, is absolutely philosophical. And here's the reason why. Yes, I starred in Fortune Cookie. Yes, I wrote it and I directed and I produced it. All characters, whenever I write, it's usually have some extension of me. I am a control freak who doesn't do well with ambiguities. It's very obvious.
Oh my God. I was going to ask you that question before Alan said that. I was going to be like, Rudy, do you struggle with ambiguity, man?
100%. And that's
Wow.
the running joke on Good is in the Details is, wait, what? There's no answer. I didn't really realize that when I wrote Fortune Cookie. I didn't have any intent to be philosophical. What happened was one day I looked at my desk at work and I noticed, this is going to sound crazy, but it's okay. I keep telling you people I'm crazy. I noticed I had a stack of about 50 to 70 fortunes that I saved from, there's a Panda Express that I was eating too much at. This is when I didn't eat very well, and I spent too much time focusing at work, and just, Panda is really easy to go to. I noticed I was saving these fortunes, and I noticed that I was actually reading them occasionally. And I think that I was doing that for some kind of a comfort. Like whenever I would feel down, I would go look at these good fortunes and I would get some answers. Of course, I would plug in the answers there, right? That's the whole point of fortunes is They tell you something and then you go, oh yeah, this means X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. And then that triggered Fortune Cookie. It was my way of trying to exercise control over whatever I was dealing with at that time. And I just kind of made up the character, and the movie went forward with that. It was a very wonderful experience doing Fortune Cookie while we were in COVID. It was just me and a bunch of amateur actors, and the first part of COVID, acting and production shut down, and a buddy of mine said, hey man, I'm really bummed out. Like, don't you write? Do you have something that we can just throw together really quickly? And I said, yeah, dude, I got this film Fortune Cookie that I wrote, and I sent it to him, and he said to some actor buddies, and we filmed it. And it was, while we filmed it, that's very, very interesting. It took over a year to get it edited and everything, because number one, it almost got burned down in the Lake Tahoe fire because the master was the guy's parents literally went to their house in South Lake Tahoe and grabbed the computer and some last minute things before like their house almost burned down. And then lo and behold, a month later, our editor musician got carjacked in San Francisco, and he lost a bunch of the materials. And so it's just kind of funny how like the underlying message of the movie is you have no control, like over any, no matter what you think that you have control over, you have no control over anything. And that actually happened with the production of the movie as well. So thank you for asking and watching it.
Of course, man.
Well, and then Gwen, how about your love of philosophy? Where did that stem from?
Honestly, I think it was my second semester of university, and I took a philosophy course, and I just fell in love with it. It's all I wanted to do. I knew that I just had to read more of it. And it wasn't until I think my graduate years where I became introduced to existentialism, and then I became obsessed with that. But there's something about reading really great works. This can be of literature or of philosophy, where I personally just kind of felt a calling. I don't know how else to explain. I felt the most alive when I was working on reading these texts, and this sense of gratitude that I had the opportunity to read some of the most brilliant minds in history. And with Rudy's film Fortune Cookie, after I watched it, I happened to have been teaching a class where we were reading Simone de Beauvoir's short story, The Woman Destroyed. And I told him that's what I then got out of his film, was from Simone de Beauvoir's point of view, the Woman Destroyed is really a story about a woman who has lived her life according to everybody's standards about what she perceived to be a good life. And she was also very much trapped in a gender role, which Beauvoir writes a lot about. And then at the end, the woman needs to decide how she's terrified because she has freedom. She's been released from all of these ideas about what it means to be a woman, and what she does with that freedom. We just know she ends it by saying, I'm just terrified, I am afraid. And it was reminding me so much of when Rudy in his short, this question of, if we're set up with all of these rules, what do we do when we actually let go of them? And I think that's why in my later studying, why I fell in love with existentialism, because traditional philosophy is all about rules, it's all about structure, it's all about logic, it's all about universals. And then here these existentialists come along and they throw that to the wind and just say, what does it mean to be human? And how do we deal with that? And it's messy. And people don't want to talk about it because there are no conclusions. But I really liked that, because there is this moment, actually Camus wrote this. There's this moment, he says in one of his books, I think it's The Myth of Sisyphus, where he says, the absurd can strike anyone on a street corner. And it is that moment where you just realize that, like, it is your life and there are no rules, and you can do what you want. You are free to do what you want. And with that comes this nervousness, but you kind of want that because that means you are responsible for your future. When you don't have any kind of anxiety, that means because you don't perceive any kind of responsibility. And so I think that there is this good notion of anxiety that comes with freedom. Anyways, I'm kind of going off on a tangent about what I love about philosophy, but I totally fell in love with the existentialist for that reason. It made me feel alive, and it just felt so useful for how we structure our everyday lives.
Yeah. And what I love so much about it, to quote somebody who's coming on our podcast in a couple of weeks, Sky Cleary. So if you look at the major philosophies, and there was a pretty notable book that came out a couple of years ago, obviously a bunch of guests that we had on from it, How to Live a Good Life. And so like a lot of the authors had really great conceptions of what the good life is. I mean, it's based on their own kind of different schools of thought in terms of philosophy. But what I loved so much about Sky's chapter was it was essentially like guideposts. She was like, look, man, if you're thinking to, or you're looking to existentialism to tell you what to do, it's just not going to happen, moment. We don't really have answers per se. I love Rudy shaking his head, right? So we have like, these sort of big picture ideas of where you could go and questions about what you should think about, you think about what's sort of meaningful to you. What does it mean, obviously, to create a life full of like freedom and sort of an extravagance in some way, a life that's, let's say, kind of bountiful, right? Bountiful in whatever that kind of means to you. And I love that because here's this person, and obviously it's not just Sky, it's kind of the field in itself, existentialism. But here are these people who are like, hey, man, we're just humans, right? We could kind of give you sort of understandings, and we could give you sort of kind of ways to look at the world, or ways rather to think about the world, but we can't actually tell you what's right. And sometimes, especially if you're going to go back into like the history of philosophy and you look at somebody like Plato, who had these sort of absolutes, which obviously, I mean, are bullshit. There's no such thing as forms. I mean, objective sort of even morality isn't necessarily even a thing, right? So if we think about it that way, I really like the kind of humility there. And that always kind of struck me about existentialism, that even though as big and as famous, as kind of like as intelligent as these people were, they always knew their limits. And I always appreciated that about them. All right, Rudy, you had a thought. Go for it.
On that very point, trying to find a tenet of philosophy, whether it's existentialism or whether it's stoicism, right? And Gwen and I touched upon this on an episode where it was called Understanding Anxiety, where we had a psychologist come on, and I asked the question because from my own experience, at the beginning of the pandemic, I, started reading Marcus Aurelius and try to apply the tenets of stoicism to, my OCD, me losing my head on the whole thing. Whereas the reality is I suffer from anxiety, period. I do. So, stoicism is not going to solve that problem. But I asked the question, what do you think of patients coming in and asking you about, and this is to the psychotherapist, should they apply stoicism in order to address their anxiety? And I mean, basically at the end of the day, it was just kind of like, but those are just guideposts. Like, yeah, in certain situations, should you be calm and just kind of, take it as it comes? I'm being very, very simplistic here with stoicism. Yeah, sure, that would be good, but we're all biologically different. We're all made up differently. Like some people are more prone to anxiety and anxiety attacks. And stoicism is, while it's great and it looks good on a coffee table, it's not going to solve all of your problems. And philosophy is not there for you to solve all your problems. It's just for you to kind of try to live a better life, I suppose. I know I'm replugging our podcast again, but really, I mean, somebody tell me if I'm wrong, but I mean, that is one of the goals of philosophy, is just to live a little bit better. It's not going to tell you how to actually live your entire life. Am I wrong or am I right about that?
I think that comes from Socrates. That comes from the Apology, from his trial. That one of the things that I've always thought was so fascinating and so interesting is that when Socrates was on trial, that in part when he's explaining why he's on trial, for being annoying, which I always say that's why he was executed, for being annoying. That's what happened. But there was an oracle who said there was no one wiser than Socrates. And upon hearing that news, he didn't say, yay, good for me. He wanted to inquire into what that meant. And so to understand the meaning of the oracle, he had to go out into the world and dialogue with others. And that's also one of the reasons why I value philosophy and I value, what we do. And I like podcasts in general for this reason. And I enjoy teaching for this reason, is that when you dialogue with others, you will understand the truth about yourself, that there is so much to come from it, as opposed to just retreating from the world. Now, I'm not anti-meditation or anything like that, but I think the fact that Socrates uncovered the truth of what the oracle meant through dialogue is very important. I think that's significant.
Yeah.
And he said that's what it meant to be good. That was also the moral life. The moral life was to learn. So the moral life is also, I'm sorry, I just realized that part of Rudy's question was that, what does it mean to be a good man? This is something that Socrates was talking about, because during his trial, there was this question of, where he was being rhetorical and saying, some of you might say, aren't you ashamed for doing what you've done, that this may cause your death? And he responds by saying no, because what makes a life worth living? And what makes a life worth living is not the question of life or death, focusing on the body, but it is on focusing on, did I act rightly? Did I act justly? And that is what determines a life, or a man of worth. I'm saying man specifically. I'm not being gender friendly, because he meant men. Right. But That's, we no one's perfect. But that's part of the moral life, is to be curious, because that means that you are respecting the possibilities of the soul, and at the same time you're not claiming to have divine knowledge. So you are being humble, and you are also inviting growth. And so morality and curiosity for the ancient Greeks go hand in hand. And I think that, Rudy, you're right. That's partly what it means to live life well, both to be happy and also to be good in a moral sense.
So on our episode with you guys, which it would be great to do some kind of a connection between the two, we ended it with me being a narcissist. Now Gwen just brought me kind of around full circle by calling me moral because of my curiosity. Thank you, Gwen. You rescued me. You just seriously just rescued me.
I know. And we just thought you had great hair. It turns out you're like also a good guy.
Wait, so okay, Rudy, I have a kind of a tough question for you then. So okay, and just in terms of philosophy, right? So let's say we'll take for granted that there are no sort of objective answers here for the most part, right? But what about the fact that we can't really escape it, right? So like in the search of justice, or in the search of truth, in the search of even like what a potential afterlife is there such thing as a divine whatever, right? So I mean, do you think it's kind of lazy to say like, oh, okay, we should just throw our hands up because these answers don't exist? Because, or is it so that like, as long as kind of human beings exist, these questions are always going to be sort of persistent, and they're always going to kind of be petulant in a way too?
He set me up. He set me up really well. He basically, what he asked me is, do I think philosophy students and philosophers are lazy? It's a very interesting question. No, they're not lazy. You want to know why? Here's the reason why. Because they will continue to read, and they will continue to study other philosophers, I think, in order to try to answer the question. I think it's unfair to paint philosophers as, and I'm not saying that you did, I'm referring to myself as being like, there's no answers, you bunch of lazy asses, what's the matter with you people? Figure it out and move forward. That's the lawyer side of me coming out. I actually think philosophers work really, really hard. When you listen to Gwen, and when she mentions these names of these philosophers and their writings and everything, it's an incredible about how much time she has spent I mean, look at those books behind her. She has spent a godly amount of time reading, I think, maybe to try to come close to answering whatever questions Gwen is trying to figure out in her own personal life. I think that's one of the reasons. Sure, I'm sure there's some curiosity, and I know that it's her day job to be a philosopher, but I do think that she is working hard to try to answer those questions. But unlike me, she is better with ambiguity. I'm not very good with ambiguity. And that is because I just have these, mental issues. I need answers, and I that's just the way I am. But no, I do think that philosophers work hard. Hopefully nobody will ever, hold this against me on a future episode where I'm going to continue to bash philosophy and philosophy students and philosophy teachers. But I think they actually work their ass off. That's what I think.
Yeah, and then Alan, to set you up here. So what this kind of made me think of is like, so there's this really great documentary on Warren Buffett. And then so like for anybody who knows anything about Warren Buffett, I mean, he doesn't really deal with people. It's not his thing. He's actually a lot like Rudy. His whole concept of like people is they're too difficult. It doesn't really matter how smart you are. You'll never understand them, and you'll never really figure it out. So what's the point, right? Just work with numbers. Numbers are safe. Numbers are sort of, you can extract meaning from them, right? You can understand them, right? So for you, so Alan kind of has this great way of applying philosophy to understanding people, which I really love. So, I mean, we can think about just like ultimate truths and whatnot. And then in some way, we wouldn't like find fault with the person who throws his or her hands up and says, screw it, we'll never figure them out anyway, right? But you can actually apply philosophy in a great way to relationships, right? Like when you're talking about understanding other people and obviously creating a harmony between them. So can you tell us about that?
Oh, sure. You're referring to seeking first to understand, then to be understood. Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, if anyone's a stranger to that concept, essentially people feel better when you try to show that you understand their perspective, right? We talked about this actually on our last podcast, on our interview. Steel manning, for example, is part of that, right? Where you might say back to them what it is that you understood, right? And then they feel understood by you, and therefore feel like more trusting of you and want to communicate back with you, right? But actually, something I wanted to add, something else to Rudy, what Rudy said. So, I think there's a usefulness to putting labels on things and trying to structure things in a way that is logical and makes sense. But at the same time, I feel like labels can be limiting in a way. Like, for example, if let's say the concept of Rudy Salo, or the concept of Gwen Dolske, right? I mean, even if I like wrote your names down, I know that that's referring to you guys, but does that word or does that label necessarily encapsulate all that's you? Like the ineffable nature of who you really are, all of your experiences, sense perceptions, current perception of everything that's happening. I mean, I couldn't really capture that I mean, it's useful, right? I mean, I could know who I'm talking about, right? Or if I'm referring to a label about something, maybe a concept in philosophy or psychology, you name it. But then there are some things that it's almost impossible to capture in a label. And that's why you almost have to surrender to this mystery, right? Of what somebody is, or what life might be, or what is the good life, and so on.
Right.
I don't know.
You're saying the ambiguity is sort of inherent.
Yeah, I mean, for example, the concept of an apple, or the concept of honey, right? If I have an apple, I know that it's an apple, or I'm pointing to an apple, but I can't really know the apple unless maybe I take a bite and try it, right? Or maybe that's not even really knowing the apple either. I mean, that's not necessarily knowing it, but now I'm just kind of
you guys are starting to lose me. See, you start asking questions like what's an apple and stuff like that. That's when I want to start banging my head up against this wall over here. You see, that's me.
You can take a bite out of Rudy to see.
The hair. No, I'm just kidding.
What was interesting was when you said our names. Oh, well, he is Rudy Salo, or she is Gwen Dolske. I mean, that's a lot more of a broader, right? Because when you say Rudy Salo, that's what I think is like, that's my whole life. That's my life history. I talk a lot about my life history. Same thing with Gwen, and when you say Gwendolyn Dolske. Now, if you say the words, oh, he is a lawyer, or oh, she is a teacher, or oh, he is an actor, or oh, she is a writer, I feel like those are like, yeah, okay, that's one small part of me. That there's more to that. Like when you say those words, lawyer, writer, teacher, there's a universal concept of what, well, okay, everyone knows what lawyers do and what teachers do, versus Rudy Salo or Gwen Dolske. Like that's just automatically subjective, because saying my name is my life. Like that's I've always, since birth, that's what I've been. Well, the funny story about that is my mom didn't know that my dad was going to name me Rudy Salo. She thought she thought my name was going to be Anthony, and then all of a sudden the name Rudy showed up on the birth certificate. That's a whole other side story. But I find labels like career choices, right? When you talk about a career choice, that can really box you in, and we talk a lot about that on Good as in the Details podcast. We talk a lot about how the changing of what you are career-wise, and how the internet kind of threw everything for a tizzy, and our concept of retirement, our concept of professionalism, our concept of, well, what does it mean to work in an office, and like we're in this flux right now that I don't even know if labels will mean anything anymore, because the way the world works and the way we work as a society is ever changing. And I think the pandemic kind of threw the light on that 100%. I don't know if I necessarily answered any of the questions there, but I was just trying to talk about labels in general, and how right now, as a result of the internet, as a result of COVID-19, as a result of all the things that have been upended, I don't even know if labels are going to mean anything anymore.
I'm gonna jump in. Is it okay if I jump in?
I was just gonna,
yeah.
I was just gonna say you kind of proved Alan's point because you have multiple personalities.
Well, that's one of the things I really, just to draw from existentialism, that I really loved, is that one of the things that they rejected was the notion, it would be interesting what you think from a psychology point of view, but the notion of a human nature, they actually rejected it. And even that the definition that Aristotle gave of what does it mean to be human is that man is a rational animal. And that wasn't really enough. And they defined the human as free and perpetually in flux, and that you learn what you are in situation, and that freedom of going outside the definition is precisely what makes the human being. And that's something that's very cool. I mean, you can wake up tomorrow and say, you know what, I'm going to learn Sanskrit, and just all of a sudden that is a new part of who you are. You can say, I'm going to run a marathon, and then all of a sudden you become a runner. And one of the beautiful things about being human is that there is nothing that is confining us. We get comfortable with labels and with being confined. Just to reference The Woman Destroyed again, that was one of the things that the main character was very, very comfortable in being wife and mother, and those roles ended. And then she did not even know how to live because she had completely defined herself according to other people in her life, and they all outgrew her, and she stayed the same, almost like an object. She didn't change at all. So that would be the difference between an object and a human being, is that the object has its definition, like the apple, whereas the human being is constantly in flux. And we also have a lot to learn about ourselves. I mean, we don't know in the next 10 years if an event, then we will also find out more about what kind of a person we are in a different situation. We'll grow to be a different person. We'll redefine ourselves over and over again. And that's part of the beauty of being human. And I would say also, like with labels, I can't even tell you how many times somebody has said to me, you're a professor, you don't look like one. And I'm not sure what I'm supposed to look like. I mean, I am. I study philosophy, but I know that the reaction from men, for instance, like if I'm at a cafe and I'm reading, some literature and it's got a heavy label on it, where a man will look at it, like pass by the table and look at the book and be like, whoa, kind of like this look of like, little lady, why are you reading this giant book? Where people have this conception of, let's say, what a philosopher would look like. And I think that a lot of that is breaking down for many, many professions. And that's actually very cool to see.
Wow, there's a lot of things I want to tackle there. Well, the first thing that you reminded me of is Sartre, in a way. I know you brought up Simone de Beauvoir, but Sartre, I believe, said being precedes essence, right? Like I am comes before I am this or that, right? So what's interesting about that is that I feel like that ties into this whole label thing, right? I mean, essentially, people are sometimes their identity is formed in reaction, right? Like there was this concept of the man of, if I remember correctly, now I'm digging back into like college brain right now, but there was, I believe this is Nietzsche, the man of resentment. There's like a person who exists as a no to everything, and then that person gets their whole identity formed by resisting everything that happens in their life, like living in reaction to everything. And then there's another version of a person or man, which is the man of resentment, who actually takes like proactive action in order to sort of design their, not necessarily design the reality, but that's my understanding of it. And I find that's very interesting too, just to kind of tie that to what you said. And there's so many things pop up though that I want to discuss too. Like a lot of ideas come up. Also, the age of the internet, right? In a way, I can see how you're saying that these labels or structures are sort of breaking down, because in a way, especially with the advent of podcasting, a lot of the gatekeepers that existed for certain types of knowledge or entertainment, you name it, for that to sort of be exposed to people, they're not really there anymore, or they are, but those structures are kind of falling apart. Before, there were however many networks available that might host somebody, like, I don't know, I don't know if PBS is a good example, but let's say before podcasting, if there was PBS or Discovery or something where they might have a documentary and then have an educator on to maybe speak on a certain subject or whatever, that was usually how maybe a professor or a philosopher or you name it might get exposure to like a bigger audience, right? But then YouTube, podcasting, all of that came out and changed the game completely, which is what's amazing about your podcast and podcasting in general. So,
cool. Okay, you guys are gonna.
It raises a question, right? About, I mean, look at the state of our country. Look at the state of a lot of the fighting that's going on, and how people are becoming even more entrenched in their ideas and not listening sometimes to the other side, and the blues and the reds, everything that's going on in this country that I constantly worry about and thinking, it's like, were we ready for the internet? Should there still be gatekeepers? I mean, those are the philosophical questions that I like to think about, right? I think incessantly about, well, gee, maybe there were gatekeepers, maybe having free access to all the information in the world, or being able to pick and choose the information that we want in order to, for confirmation bias purposes, maybe that wasn't a good thing. Much like everything in human existence, things will get bad, they will get worse, they'll work each other out, and then we'll move on as a society going forward. But that's the type of stuff that I like to think about. Not trying to be a downer here. I worry about society.
I'm with you on this, actually. So I'm not an Alex Jones guy at all, but his show, right? It was called InfoWars. And what's interesting about that title is that's essentially what's sort of happening, right? There's a sort of an info war. There's like this war for the controlling.
Are you literally promoting Alex Jones on our podcast?
I am not. How did you get that from that? I'm just trying to use that term.
We left-wing liberal podcasters, sure, let's throw a bone to Alex Jones every once in a while.
Okay, sure, but it's okay. But my point, though, is essentially that there's sort of this like fight for the controlling paradigm in a way, right? Like, since now it's sort of a free-for-all with all these different let's say podcasts or shows or YouTube, whatever, or media. Essentially, they're fighting for as many views as possible, doing whatever they can. Clickbait this sort of marketing, blah, 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 blah. And because of that free-for-all, it's very chaotic, right? And I kind of connect with you on that, because it's like, maybe there were gatekeepers for a reason before. And then there's so many pros and cons to this sort of, quote unquote, brave new world, right? But who knows, maybe there's a next step, or there should be a next step. I just can't see what that paradigm would be, but maybe there's something that'll bring a little levity to the chaos. But that could be just like this idealistic, hopeful view of the future. Some people don't share that. So.
Okay, since you mentioned idealism, you guys are going to hate me. So when it comes back to the question of human nature, so unfortunately with the existentialists, as wonderful as they were, the way that they kind of, just like with Sartre, the way that he kind of conceived freedom, and the same way they kind of conceived human nature as like this sort of bountiful kind of void of possibility, is actually not true. And then so unfortunately when it comes to human nature, there is a human nature. It's not one particular essence, which is really, really nice. But when you're looking at like something like twin studies, they're really kind of awesome, because they really tell us what it's like in different environments when you have with the same sets of genes or very similar sets of genes. So what unfortunately happens is a lot of the times is that you'll have people, like, again, if you separate twins out, you'll have, like, let's say one kid in a kind of disturbed home where, let's say, I don't know, let's say maybe there's a lot of abuse going on, trauma, etc. And then you'll have, like, let's say they're twin, and you put them in kind of another home that's almost completely disparate from that one, and they end up with the same kind of mental health picture, which, like, obviously really sucks. And then so what you kind of see is that a lot of times, even though obviously it's great, and I love, okay, so I want to be really careful how I say this, because so on the left, there's this sort of idea that behavioral genetics is bullshit. And there's this idea that behavioral genetics is inherently pretty much all of the isms. It's sort of misogynistic. It's, sort of every phobia that you could kind of think of. I don't really necessarily think that's true, especially because the science and the data really are what they are. And if you think about even something like, let's say, like, with like trans people, right? So trans people will never tell you that, oh, well, this is just like there's a void in human nature that I just, woke up one day and I decided, well, I'm going to be trans. It's not really like that. The idea there is that there's some sort of inherent genetic disposition toward it. And again, we see this with kind of mental health pictures as well. So again, even though I love the notion that existentialism has, and there is some variability. So if you look at like the big 5-factor model of personality, you can see that, let's say with psychotherapy, with other interventions, let's say good friendships, good social circles, people change on those, on like each spectrum, on each dimension. So if somebody, let's say, is highly neurotic, they could go back a couple of points. If a person is very low on extroversion, they could kind of go up a couple of points, etc. But for the most part, what you see is that temperaments are pretty much inborn. And even though they do fluctuate over a lifetime, it's nowhere near sort of, again, this existentialist notion of, well, I could just become and be whoever I want. It's nowhere near that simple. But I mean, again, what's cool about it is that even though there is a temperament, there are certain environments that you could put people in, and then obviously they will improve and they'll get better. But the thing is, it's like, so just to kind of give you like a nutshell of what the mental health picture could look like. So let's say if we're thinking about the DSM-5 criteria, and let's say you have a kid who has like generalized anxiety disorder. So let's say that kid goes through a course of therapy, let's say maybe 8 weeks to, I don't know, a couple of months, right? So maybe 3-4 months, whatever it is. And so even though that kid will not meet the criteria for generalized anxiety anymore, if the therapy is successful, obviously, and even probably with medication too. But the point there is that when we're looking at the spectrums on neurotic, that kid is still going to be above average in the neurotic spectrum. So he or she may not, like, again, you may not be able to diagnose them with the generalized anxiety or whatever it is, but the thing is, they're still going to be high in neuroticism, which shows that there is such a thing as human nature. Again, it's not ubiquitous in the sense of like, let's say every man is like this, and every woman is like this. No, that's just silly, right? It's way more complicated than that. But there is such a thing as inborn temperament, and I really do think that we have to take it seriously.
Oh yeah, I always, I tell my students whenever we're going over existentialism to keep in mind that this is long before we understand brain science or genetics or things like that. When they're coming to those, wait, okay, when they're
Rudy has to go, right?
Yeah,
Rudy, it was a pleasure having you on. Take care.
that we have to take factor in those things. One of the things that I do wonder about, though, when it comes to the science, and I'm glad you said like it's not ubiquitous. Like if you were to say all men are X, it's going to be very difficult to fill that in, or all women are X. So I wonder if part of the labeling didn't have. I don't wonder. I think, I think the labeling that had to do with the way in which human nature worked was that it was all to reinforce a power structure. So saying all women are X, or all African Americans are, or anyone who's Asian is, that those labelings were done in such a way in order to maintain a power structure.
Right.
Because they didn't consider, because not every human was looked at in the same.
Right. And I love that you mentioned that, because that sort of harkens to critical race theory. So the idea is there's so much truth in sort of these left-wing ideas. But I wish there were a way where sort of the two kind of, not even the two sides, because we're not even talking about right-wingers who are necessarily behavioral geneticists. If anything, they believe like in these sort of like crude conceptions of what men and women are just based on like the Bible or whatever it is, right? But I wish there were a way that for, again, I love the ideals, but I wish there were a way for a lot of people on the left to take the science seriously and to say that, or at least to think that there's, look, I know going back to like Francis Galton and social Darwinism, I understand there's that component there, but I just don't think that at this point, that for the most part, like when we're talking about, again, something like behavioral genetics, social psychology, obviously too, I don't think that these people are necessarily sort of discounting the fact that, there's so much probability and possibility within human beings. But I think they're saying like, look, this is just what it is. You're not born a blank slate. Because it's interesting, because on the left, you have on the one side them saying, okay, well, you are a blank slate and you could just be whatever you want. But then science saying like, hey, this was debunked like decades ago. You are not a blank slate. That doesn't necessarily exist. Psychologists know it. Again, geneticists know it. But yet somehow it's sort of like, politically speaking, it's taking us some time to get to that point.
Yeah. I even say, like, with all of the books that I have here, my dad was also a reader. And those are part of the gifts. When I would come home from school, there would be a new book. He would get two copies of the same book, and then we would read to each other. I think our first book was Treasure Island. It's one of my favorite memories. And so now obviously I'm a bookworm and I've gone into academia. Now, is that natural, or is that nurture? Am I introverted like my dad, or we're both only children brought up in Southern California? We have a lot in common to brought us to a similar path, or was that all nurturing? But I would think that some of that just has to be inherent, because I can't even explain how I am drawn to reading. It doesn't feel like a choice. Or even when people would ask me, how did you choose philosophy? And I said, well, I didn't. It's kind of like how if you taste chocolate and you like it, you didn't make that decision. It was just true. And that's how I felt about philosophy.
Oh, you want to hear the one of the most kind of like prominent theories of like the acquisition or the desire for the acquisition of knowledge?
Okay.
Okay, so if you think about it, right? So if let's say, anxiety, right, or high levels or low levels or whatever of anxiety are for the most part inherited, right? If you think about the acquisition of knowledge, it's really just a way to quell a sense of uncertainty. So for the person who is the reader and wants to learn a ton about the world, chances are they're probably also highly anxious. So it's not that per se you inherited the idea or like the desire to be a reader per se, but it's more like you inherited the desire to learn about the world because like maybe you were a really anxious kid. Yeah.
Interesting.
I don't know. There is something about just that life is short and it's kind of, there's only so much time to learn and to experience things. And I can't really bear my time being wasted in a different way than I think. So that's one of the reasons why I enjoy traveling and I enjoy reading. I just enjoy learning so much.
Yeah. And
What
then
about-
so yeah, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, what about introverted versus extrovert? Because this was on a podcast episode that Rudy and I did, and Rudy made a comment that made me laugh as I was listening to it. And we were talking with a former FBI agent who was talking about the prison system. And
Cortez.
Rudy says, what's that?
Jeffrey Cortez.
Oh, yeah. And Rudy made a comment. So Rudy's extroverted, and Rudy made a comment. Everyone's biggest fear is going to prison. And I called him up and I said, when I was a little girl and I first learned that there was such a thing as prison, I thought that sounded really nice. I thought you'd get a room to yourself and I could just sit on a bed and read and no one would bother me. And I was like, this sounds like heaven. And so, but I was too young to really understand introverted or extroverted. Like I couldn't have been taught that. Right. So what do you think about this talk about introverted versus extroverts? Like, is there a biological basis to it, or is it all nonsense and pop psychology?
Yeah. So, okay, with introversion, extroversion, I mean, there's no like, it's not dichotomous. So obviously what that means is that it doesn't exist just in the two spheres. So what happens is if you look at the big five, so extroversion is a part of the dimensions. And then you have this one dimension of extroversion, obviously low on extroversion pretty much is, pure introversion if that exists. Right. And then you have like high on extroversion, which is like where Rudy has, somewhere, give or take, somewhere up on that spectrum. But what you see is that like with parents and their kids actually resemble them on the big five. So not always, obviously, and it's not like a pure connection. So let me just be clear, but there are high correlations between kids and their parents and actually where they fall on these particular five spectrums. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I read the book Quiet by, I think her name is
Susan Cain.
Yeah. And I really, really liked it. And I have to tell you, being an introvert was key for the pandemic, for lockdown, because all the introverts, we did just fine. It was all the extroverts that were panicking.
Yeah. And then so since we're obviously on the topic of philosophy and just sort of having these big questions and wanting to answer them. So from your perspective, right? Because philosophy is obviously, it's a hard thing to teach. It's a hard thing to understand. When you guys started the podcast, has it become easier for you to kind of translate that work for the students? Because I mean, a lot of what you do is translated to the general public.
I think so. Honestly, having Rudy is so helpful, because I think I'll use language that I don't even realize is just locked into the discipline, that it doesn't make sense for everybody else. And so I think that I become a better teacher. But one of the other goals is to show my students what it's like to be a student. So they can actually see me or hear me on the podcast interviewing people. And even though I have a PhD, that I am in a position where I'm still continually learning and seeking out other experts in order to know more and to have some sort of a platform for sharing ideas. And that's been, I think, one of the most exciting things, is to create the space for ideas that to be out there and to get a broader audience to participate in other people's intellectual journey in that way. And I wanted the students to get a sense of that, because on the podcast, really, I mean, I'm not saying very much. It's more of just asking questions and kind of wanting to figure out the underscoring ideas for different people's professions and the implications. So the floor is theirs to really talk. And that's for my students to also have access to these experts. The students don't read as much as students did 20, 30, or actually any time before. But this other media version is another way for them to access materials for them to learn. So I think one of the mistakes people have made in education is to say that because students have a shorter attention span and they don't read as much, those things are true, but that doesn't mean that there's not a desire to learn more, that there's not some other avenue in order to get access to these ideas. So that's also another goal.
Right. So
yeah, sorry, no, just I found, for example, that latest episode of the podcast very interesting, right? So the FBI agent, or former FBI agent, I believe, you asked him a question. I believe it was about corruption. You asked, can you be corrupt without necessarily intending corruption? Like, does that ever happen? Has anyone done something that is objectively corrupt without necessarily intending it? Whether it's maybe giving a gratuity, like a gift, or maybe something else, maybe that they could have done. And like questions like that kind of stuck out to me, which I think it is important to ask things like that. And I could see how you're sort of in a position of a student in a way when you ask these questions, to maybe someone in a different field, as far as law or FBI, is concerned, or the prison system, I believe, was covered in that episode too. So it's very interesting.
Yeah. It's, and you have to be vulnerable too, which I don't know was always easy for me. Maybe part of it has to do with being a woman in a male dominated field where it really, you don't want to look stupid. I mean, I don't know. There seems to be more of a cost there for women. And so being on the podcast and interviewing experts and really sometimes having absolutely no idea, I just have a deficit of knowledge in their field, which makes me want to learn from them more. But there is a bit of a fear that I'm going to ask something that is a little bit dumb or obvious, and getting over that vulnerability has also just been really helpful for my own personal growth. But I think also for the students to hear like, oh, sometimes, she has questions too. So you can't always just pretend to walk around like you know everything, but you have to have that humility. And that's like goes back to what I was saying about Socrates. Like, I think that that's one of the most valuable lessons from Socrates is that there is just a joy for curiosity for its own sake. And it's a good way to live.
I'm with you. Yeah, for me, I relate to this hardcore. There have been guests on the show where I'm just like, I have nothing. I almost sometimes have nothing to say, but then I try to sort of let go of that sort of maybe imposter. Is that imposter syndrome? Yeah. Sort of in a way. I mean, technically, if I'm already in the position of podcast host, like, hey, act the part, get engaged, don't necessarily be nervous or afraid to ask somebody about something you don't necessarily know about, right? So I relate to that hardcore. I do try to prepare before shows, maybe some questions as far as that goes, just to be somewhat prepared. But I don't know. He knows for a fact, just from being with me, there have been times where I've been completely silent for most of an episode, kind of more in the earlier episodes, but yeah.
So I think for like Alan, which I think a lot of people struggle with, and I mean, it makes a ton of sense, is that like, and I've told you this before, but I think it's just worth saying on the episode, is that you're actually supposed to do that. You're supposed to ask basic questions, because for the most part, like people who are listening to this, they're not going to be experts. Most academics do not have time to sit and listen to podcasts of material that they already know. I mean, it's just not going to happen. Sure. So a lot of the people who are listening to this are either people who just like have a cursory interest in psychology, so not psychology just, but psychology and philosophy, or people who are, let's say, maybe students, or sort of they're like, kind of developing some interest in it, or maybe a little bit more moderate, but you usually don't have experts on it. Like, that's why our guests come on, because they want to kind of spread their information. So for you, what I would always say, and this, is that ask questions. Like, no question is stupid, man. And if anything, what it usually does is it brings it out of the guest. So, and Gwen, I'm assuming you found the same thing for your show too.
Yeah. And I will say that we had an episode, it was with a cardiologist, and that's in the title of the episode. I'm not going to say what it was, but I did ask a question that was not my best. And let's just say I had made an error about basic anatomy. And the guest was so sweet. He was, when he looked at me and he said, I think she's blushing, because we are actually in studio for this. And as I listened back to the episode, I can't even tell you how badly there was a part of me that wanted to edit it out. To just say, like, I want to edit out the fact that I just asked something stupid and it's so obvious that even the guest is like, she is blushing. But I had to step back and put my ego out of it. Is it kind of entertaining to hear? Yes, it was. It was a silly thing. And it also just made me very human, but it was, was it funny? Yes, my error was funny. And so I kept it in. And I guess that's important, especially in this day of social media where everybody's constantly projecting their best self.
Right.
That it's important to remind ourselves that we're human, we have errors, we have brain farts, all of that happens. And that's part of the joy in life. And that's what makes relationships possible. Also, when you said understanding, the more vulnerable you allow yourself to be, then the more understanding and grace I think that you give to other people instead of trying to, show perfection all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, and you guys are going to love this, by the way. So you know what the data shows? So it's actually, if you're already really competent, and let's say you have credentials. So like, obviously, Gwen, you would have a PhD. So if you already come from a place of competence and you make a mistake, you're humanized. So vice versa though, right? So it's like, if you don't have credentials and you're not already kind of perceived as a competent person, let's say, either people don't know you or whatever it is, then they form the quick judgment of, oh, this person is stupid. So if you already have the kind of history behind you where you're doing the podcast, people have heard you, they know who you are, they kind of know what your ideas are, what sort of the complexity of what you can understand is, they're not going to judge you for it. So it's actually the opposite. They'll be like, oh, wow, we can actually, like, she's not like superhuman. We can actually like talk to her maybe someday. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting how that works. All right. And then, so before we wrap up, what do you hope the message of your podcast, if there were sort of a general theme, what would you hope, or what would you want people to pick up on, to take away from it?
I want people, as I've said before, I think to enjoy that process of thinking. I really want to be part of making the world a good place. And with the skill set that I have is that I'm a philosopher and I'm an introvert and I have an obese cat and that's my life. And how am I going to participate in the world being a better place? And as far as my own scholarship, I don't think I'm the best scholar, but I think that I do have a knack for noting when there are good ideas and really having a space where people can come on and share those ideas and participating in that journey. That's really what I want to get out. Like there was one book called The Gravity of Joy by Dr. Angela Gorel, and we had her on the show. And after that episode, I got texts and emails, messages on Instagram by a handful of people who bought her book as a result of that show. And that felt incredible because she deserved that. Her book was so good. I want everyone to read it. She deserved that. And to participate in that was just such a great feeling. So I guess what I want for people to get out of the show is that I'm hoping it sparks curiosity in their own lives, where they also look at the people around them. They understand humility. They understand how to listen to experts. I think we're kind of losing that sense of expertise with the age of the internet, but to have a respect for knowledge and just a desire to learn more. And I hope it brightens somebody's day.
I love it. I'm sure it does. All right, Alan, final questions for Gwen before we wrap up?
Yes. If we wanted to follow your work and Rudy as well, where could we find you both?
I think one of the best ways for both of us would be on Instagram, Good is in the Details Pod. And we also have an email, goodisinthe.detailspod@gmail.com. And then on Twitter, I think it's just in the details. I think.
Yep, it is. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think when I was trying to create it, I couldn't get Good as in the Details. I don't know why, but yeah, that's the best way to get in touch with us. And then of course, Rudy's got a ton of work on Forbes.com, which is very cool. And yeah.
Plug your blog too.
My blog. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just Prof.
I like your
Dolske,
blog.
right? Mm-hmm. Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah. I read the one about unblocking writer's block. It's very good.
Oh, I used to write on there a lot, but people don't do blogs as much anymore, but I still have it up there. I think it's just Prof. Dolske, right? At WordPress or something like that.
I believe so. We're definitely going to put the link in the description.
I appreciate that. Okay. Thank you.
You got it. All right, Gwen, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Have a good day.
You too. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. So first of all, that was awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone, if you want to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, on Twitter, we're at And again, thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.